The wagons did not know they were the entire war. 80 of them rolled into a canyon in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains of New Mexico Territory, guarded by a handful of non-combatant soldiers in a single cannon. They sat at a place called Johnson's Ranch while the army they belonged to marched away east to fight, to push the Union forces back through Glorieta Pass and clear the road to Fort Union, the last major federal stronghold between Santa Fe and the Colorado gold fields, and from there to the Pacific. The men who drove those wagons were not combat troops. They were the men who managed the animals, maintained the wheels, distributed the ammunition and the food and the medicine and the forage that kept 3,000 Texas soldiers alive and moving through country that offered no resupply. Without them, the army walking east toward Pigeon's Ranch on the morning of March 28, 1862 was not an army. It was 3,000 men walking through a desert with whatever they carried on their backs. 5 miles east of the wagons, the Confederate army won the battle. They pushed the Union line back across Pigeon's Ranch. They held the pass. When the shooting stopped that evening and Lieutenant Colonel William Scurry tallied his position, he concluded he had won. He had taken the field. The Yankees had retreated. The road to Fort Union was open. He sent a rider back to Johnson's Ranch to inform the supply train that they would be moving forward the next morning. The rider found ashes. To understand why 80 wagons in a New Mexico canyon changed the direction of the Civil War and the shape of the American West, it is necessary to understand what the Confederacy intended when it sent General Henry Hopkins Sibley north from San Antonio with 3,000 soldiers in the autumn of 1861. The Confederacy was not winning the war by conventional arithmetic. The industrial capacity of the Union, the foundries, the railroads, the shipyards, outweighed the South's ability to sustain a long conflict in every category that sustained long conflicts. Sibley and the Confederate leadership understood this with the specific clarity of men who had done the calculations and found them unfavorable. The South needed resources. It needed money. It needed access to ports that the Union blockade was systematically denying it. It needed the West. The silver mines of New Mexico, the gold fields of Colorado, the ports of California, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco. That would open Confederate access to foreign markets and foreign recognition without crossing a Union naval line. The territory between San Antonio and the Pacific coast was, in the assessment of Confederate strategists, the resource base that could sustain a war the South could not win by fighting it in the East alone. It was also, in the spring of 1862, largely undefended. The Union had pulled regular army regiments east when the war began. What remained in the New Mexico and Arizona territories was a skeleton force of regulars at Fort Craig and Fort Union, supplemented by whatever volunteer units could be assembled from the civilian population of territories that had not yet determined their own loyalties with full conviction. Sibley looked at the map and looked at the numbers, and concluded that if he moved fast and supplied himself along the way, if he kept his army fed and armed from the resources of the territory he was conquering, the road from San Antonio to the Pacific was open. He moved in January 1862. He came up the Rio Grande. He bypassed Fort Craig when the assault proved too costly. He took Albuquerque on March 2nd. He took Santa Fe on March 13th. He was 4 days' march from Fort Union. Everything depended on logistics. The population of New Mexico territory was not feeding the Confederate army out of loyalty or abundance. The territory was dry and thin, and what supplies existed were primarily in the hands of Union sympathetic merchants who were not inclined to provision a Texas army voluntarily. Sibley's 3,000 men were eating what they had brought with them, and what they had brought with them was in 80 wagons parked at Johnson's Ranch in Apache Canyon while his army marched east to clear the last obstacle between Santa Fe and the Colorado gold fields. This was the decision that destroyed the Confederate West. Major John Chivington was a Methodist preacher who had, when the war began, been given the option of an army chaplaincy. He declined and requested a fighting commission instead. He was 6 feet 3 inches tall and built in proportion, and the soldiers who served under him in the 1st Colorado Volunteers used a specific word to describe his presence in the field: imposing. He had arrived at Glorieta Pass with 400 Colorado Volunteers on March 26, 1862. Men who had marched 172 miles from Denver in 8 days through late winter mountain weather that had no patience for schedules. They had come fast because the message from the Union command in New Mexico had been explicit: get here before Sibley reaches Fort Union, or there is no stopping him. The Colorado Volunteers arrived exhausted and ready. On March 26th, Chivington attacked the Confederate advance force in Apache Canyon, caught them in a crossfire, and drove them back to their camp at Cañoncito. He had 5 men killed and 14 wounded. The Confederate force lost about 4 killed and 20 wounded, with 70 captured. Chivington broke off the action and pulled back to Kozlowski's ranch to regroup and wait for the main Union column under Colonel John Slough. Both sides spent March 27th treating their wounded and planning their next move. On the morning of March 28th, both commanding officers made the same decision simultaneously, neither knowing the other had made it. Scurry marched east to attack. Slough marched west to attack. They met before 11 in the morning at Pigeon's Ranch, a major way station on the Santa Fe Trail. Named for the French-Canadian trader Alexander Pigeon, who had built it, set against the canyon walls under the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The battle that followed was long, grinding, and inconclusive in the way that canyon battles tend to be. Neither side able to bring its full weight to bear in terrain that reduced everything to rifle fire from rock to rock and charge to charge across ground that gave advantages to the defender regardless of which side the defender happened to be on. Scurry's Texans pushed the Union line back through the afternoon. By evening, Slough had retreated first to Pigeon's Ranch and then to Kozlowski's, 5 miles east of where the fighting had been. Scurry held the field. The pass was his. The road was open. He did not know where Chivington was. Chivington had not been at Pigeon's Ranch. While Slough engaged the Confederate main body from the front, Chivington had taken approximately 400 men, guided by Lieutenant Colonel Manuel Chavez of the New Mexico Volunteers, a man who knew every canyon and mesa in the Sangre de Cristo range by feel, and moved south off the main trail, climbing Glorieta Mesa along a path that no force of men carrying rifles and equipment had any practical reason to be climbing. They climbed it anyway. The mesa rose 200 feet above Johnson's ranch. From the rim, Chivington's men looked down at what the Confederacy had brought to New Mexico territory. 80 wagons, more than 500 mules and horses, ammunition, food, forage for the animals, medicine for the wounded. The entire logistical foundation of Sibley's campaign for the West, sitting in a canyon below them, guarded by a handful of non-combatants and a single artillery piece. They went over the rim on ropes. The canyon walls were steep enough that the descent required ropes tied to trees at the mesa edge, men lowering themselves hand over hand down the rock face while maintaining enough silence that the small Confederate guard below did not hear them coming. When they reached the canyon floor, they captured the guard before a shot was fired. They spiked the cannon, drove iron spikes into the touch hole to make it unfireable. Then they began on the wagons. They set the first one alight. Then the next. Then the next. 80 wagons burning in an Apache Canyon afternoon, the smoke rising above the Sangre de Cristo range in a column visible for miles in every direction. The mules and horses, 500 or more animals that represented the draft power required to move the supply train forward, were bayoneted where they stood, not shot because shooting required powder and took time. Bayoneted systematically, until the canyon held nothing that could carry the Confederate army forward. Chivington pulled his men out and retraced the route back up the mesa and across to Kozlowski's ranch, arriving after dark. When Scurry's rider reached Johnson's ranch and found ashes, the military situation in New Mexico Territory reversed itself in the time it took one man to understand what he was looking at. Scurry had won the battle. The pass was his. The road to Fort Union was open. He had pushed the Union line back 5 miles and held the field, and every tactical objective of March 28th had been achieved. And he had nothing to feed his army tomorrow morning. No ammunition to continue the advance. No food for 3,000 men who had been marching and fighting for weeks through high desert country. No medicine for the men he had just spent the day getting wounded. No forage for the animals that were still alive and still had to be fed regardless of whether the army could afford to feed them. The Confederacy's Western campaign was not ended by superior Union firepower or a Union tactical genius who outmaneuvered Sibley's commanders. It was ended by the specific, irrefutable reality that an army without supplies in the New Mexico high desert in March of 1862 has approximately 3 choices. It can surrender. It can starve. It can retreat. Scurry withdrew to Santa Fe, then down the Rio Grande. The retreat from Santa Fe became, over the weeks that followed, one of the most grueling marches of the Civil War's Western theater. Sibley's army reduced to eating their horses and mules as the animals died. Men dying of starvation and exposure and the wounds sustained at Glorieta and Valverde. The grand campaign for the Pacific reduced to the specific arithmetic of how many men could survive the walk back to San Antonio. Sibley lost nearly 1/3 of his force on the retreat. He reached Texas in May 1862 with what remained. The Confederate territory of Arizona, declared in February 1862 in Mesilla, a political gesture that had anticipated the Western conquest, ceased to exist as a practical matter before the year was out. The Colorado gold stayed in Union hands. The California ports stayed in Union hands. The silver mines of New Mexico Territory contributed their resources to the Union war effort and not the Confederate treasury. The entire Western theater of the Civil War was determined in a single afternoon by a Methodist preacher who went over a canyon rim on a rope with 400 exhausted Colorado volunteers and burned 80 wagons. The graves of the Confederate dead at Glorieta Pass are still there, in a mass burial site across the Santa Fe Trail from Pigeon's Ranch in New Mexico Territory, where Scurry buried them after the battle. The site is quiet now. The canyon walls that the Colorado volunteers descended on ropes are unchanged. Johnson's ranch, where the wagons burned, is beneath the ground. The ashes are long gone, but the west that those wagons were supposed to conquer, the gold fields of Colorado, the silver veins of New Mexico, the ports of California, remained in Union hands because of what happened here. The army that thought it had won returned to find that winning the battle and losing the wagons were not separate outcomes. They were the same one.